So we want to thank Güero Loco, Angelita Adekdokun, and Angel Ocho for the music that played as you logged on today. While they wrote this song for MABE's conference during the pandemic, the message still stands today. Aquí estamos. Okay, so welcome. Let's find out who's here. We're going to ask you to please click on the link in the chat. Hopefully it's there. Or you can scan the QR code on the slide. And you are going to have access to a Mentimeter. We're going to ask you to to tell us what part of the puzzle are you, pick the main role, and what state are you representing. And while you are completing this Mentimeter, I want to acknowledge the many MABE members who planned and are serving as breakout room facilitators for today's roundtable discussion. MABE members have added the word MABE after their name and have the MABE logo as their Zoom background. So I'm going to share the Mentimeter so you could take a look at who's here, what roles we're playing. A lot of teacher prep representation in school districts. And here are the locations that we are in. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, of course, are the majority because this is where this conference is. But it's nice to see people from North Carolina, Colorado, DC, Texas, South Dakota, and many others. So thank you very much for completing the Mentimeter. So thank you everyone for attending today's virtual roundtable discussion, advocating for dual language education programs. We're so pleased that so many responded to our invitation. My name is Phyllis Hardy, and I am MABE's Executive Director. I'm also introducing you to MABE's board members who are joining me in facilitating today's program. President Aradna Mundabi, Conference Co-Chair Rabia Hos, and Advocacy Chairperson Laura Hamman-Ortiz. For those new to MABE, MABE stands for the Multi-State Association for Bilingual Education. We currently work with schools and districts in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Maine, and New Hampshire will be implementing a new program in the next school year. We have invited you, key partners in this region, to today's roundtable discussion to join us in support of our mission of promoting research-based dual language education programs that support bilingualism and multiculturalism for educational success. We believe that bilingualism and multiculturalism are assets that provide many advantages for our students, for all our students, especially for our English learners and our emerging bilinguals. To help us with logistics for this virtual event, we ask that you rename yourselves by adding the stakeholder group you represent in front of your name, the same part of the puzzle you selected when you responded to the Mentimeter. Check the chat for these abbreviations. Everyone has experienced Zoom meetings. You know how to mute yourself when you're not speaking. And because so many are here, we ask that you raise your hand virtually using one of the icons in the reaction buttons, or use the chat to write out your questions and comments. The goals of the roundtable are to provide you with an opportunity to advocate, to address current challenges, opportunities, and recommendations regarding the bilingual teacher shortage, to disseminate the value of dual language education programs for students, educators, families, and communities, to visualize and understand the unique components of dual language education teacher competencies, to organize productive solutions to teacher shortages, to commit to sustaining and growing a linguistically diverse teacher workforce, to affirm our communities of multilingual learners and educators, to take action by joining a network of support that cultivates dual language education programs and educators, and to evaluate the current pathways to teacher licensure. By making connections and creating opportunities for collaboration among many partners, we will be able to move forward together in creating the most equitable education and language learning programs for our students, especially those in underserved groups. This year's pre-conference advocacy event will focus on how the shortage of bilingual teachers pose a considerable challenge to our educational system, an even more pressing challenge to our bilingual and dual language education programs. I'll walk us through today's agenda. To set the context for this discussion, MABE President Aradhana Mundabi will give us a quick peek into dual language education programs. To illustrate the barriers to bilingual teacher shortages, MABE board members Laura Hamman-Ortiz and Rabia Hos will share their just published white paper highlighting the current state of bilingual teacher shortages in Rhode Island, entitled Cultivating and Expanding the Bilingual Educator Workforce in Rhode Island. The challenges, opportunities, and recommendations for policymakers, leaders, institutions for higher education described in the white paper are similar to those experienced throughout the nation. Following highlights of the bilingual teacher shortage, Dr. Michael Guerrero from EMA will summarize the National Dual Language Education Teacher Preparation Standards and describe the unique competencies of a bilingual teacher, that of critical consciousness. Dr. Conor Williams from the Century Foundation will position this issue nationally to demonstrate how this work requires collaboration among federal, state, and local policymakers and leaders, particularly to sustain and grow bilingual and dual language education. Before we move into smaller groups to process and discuss what you are learning today, we will open the session to questions to any of the presenters. After your breakout room discussion with colleagues, we ask that you identify one action you can commit that promotes alternative pathways to increase the number of bilingual teachers. By the time you leave our roundtable, you will have identified a commitment to action. I'll now pass the torch to Aradhana.
Y'all, we are so excited to have y'all here, helping us strengthen our dual language programs. But before we go over what dual language is, let's touch base on advocacy. Advocacy is at the core of everything that we do at MABE, and everybody has a role to play. So let's start with getting a sense of what advocacy means to us. We're going to participate in what's known as a waterfall. You might have done this during the pandemic. So what I'm going to ask y'all to do right now is, without pressing enter, write in the chat your definition for advocacy. And then when I say go, we're going to press enter to see what everyone's definition is at the same time. So remember, write your definition in the chat, but don't press enter. Okay, I see people looking up, so let's go ahead. When I say count three, we're going to press enter. 1, 2, 3, enter. All right, let's look at this. Okay, they're still coming in. So advocacy is speaking up and supporting minority groups or groups who have been silenced to help them get their rights. That's beautiful. The work involved in moving innovation forward. Looking for solutions. Desmadre, I like that one. I like them all. Raising awareness, public and community support. Advocacy is empowering people with the tools to have their voices heard and skills to take action. You know, there's a lot that we're seeing here about having voices heard, about not silencing people or giving voice to people who have been silenced. I love Max Weber's definition in politics as a vocation, the slow, steady, boring through incredibly hard boards. Educating the public and persuading the skeptics of the advantages of dual language instruction. Supporting a cause, idea, or policy to influence and bring about change. So these are all really great, and I haven't read all of them out loud, but they're wonderful. So now let's talk about what dual language is. Dual language are programs that develop native-like proficiency in 2 languages through both content and language arts instruction in both languages. Emergent bilingual students, or students who have a home language other than English and are gaining proficiency in English, are the heart of our dual language programs. Depending on the type of dual language program, however, English proficient students can also participate in the program and benefit quite a bit from them. We should always prioritize the experience of our language minoritized students, or students who are known federally as English learners. So in dual language, we have 3 main goals, easily remembered as the ABCs of dual language. A is high academic achievement, Students should be learning all of the grade level standards in both languages. B is bilingualism and biliteracy. We want our students to be proficient in speaking, listening, reading, and writing in both languages. And C is sociocultural competence. We want our students to be able to work and play with those who are different than they are. And even more importantly, and what many of y'all wrote about advocacy, we want our students to be able to fight for the rights of those who identify differently than they do, for the rights of those who have been silenced. So we need to work on improving access to dual language programming for our emergent bilingual students. National data demonstrates that dual language programs that follow the research are the only programs that effectively close the opportunity gap between emergent bilinguals and monolingual English speakers. So let's see the faces and hear the voices of these programs in the short video created from experts of multiple dual language schools and programs in Massachusetts. I think they can express what dual language is and should be better than I ever can.
The goal of the dual language program is academic achievement, bilingualism and biliteracy, and sociocultural competence. So we want students to leave us bilingual and biliterate, able to use those skills in the world, but also to be really comfortable communicating across difference, across language and culture.
Our ELL students are now learning a second language, which for them is English, but they're also entrenched in their native language of Spanish. For our English-speaking students, it's gaining a second language for them. That in itself is brain building.
The exciting thing about coming to Barberry School is that if you're in kindergarten, first or second grade, you're doing most of your day in Spanish. We bring together children of different racial backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and we bring them together in one place for a common goal. And that goal is for those children to learn two languages. The children are using the same curriculum as the Massachusetts standards, and they're not losing anything at all. They are simply gaining content knowledge and proficiency in a second language.
Déjame empezar con estos porque estamos...
Por ejemplo, vamos a tener niños que pueden comunicar en español, que pueden leer, que pueden escribir, que pueden funcionar a un nivel académico, no solamente a un nivel conversacional. Eso es lo que es más importante. Ellos van a poder intercambiar entre los dos idiomas.
Que están apoyando al texto. Authentic biliteracy means that you navigate the language as a literate human being, not that you know how to go to a train station or a restaurant and order food. It means that students feel confident reading, writing, communicating, expressing themselves in both languages. Both languages have equal footing and equal power. So you're not learning Spanish as a foreign language, you're learning Spanish as a language of instruction as you learn English as a language of instruction.
Para nuestra familia, saber que existía este programa bilingüe fue muy importante porque de esa forma pudimos conectar todo lo que los niños estaban aprendiendo en casa también en la escuela.
Before she came here, there was this really strong public versus private divide in her identities. I think being around other Spanish speakers for whom this is a home language and it's out in public spaces with others has made her more confident about her home identities and home languages.
I know some families feel a concern like, is my child going to be lost? Are things going to be harder for them? We really see that the children come to the same level in their content knowledge by around 3rd to 4th grade. So we see a trajectory that sometimes is different for bilingual learners, but that eventually evens out and then goes beyond what students are able to achieve monolingually.
Overall, we've seen a lot of data that shows that long term, that they will be learning more academically than a general education classroom.
I like it very much. We like to talk in Spanish and English.
Muchos estudios que hablan sobre los beneficios de ser bilingüe, obviamente la habilidad de poder comunicarse con muchas otras personas es un beneficio. También creo que hay un beneficio personal donde los niños y como adultos podrán tener más ventajas en encontrando trabajos. También creo que hay un beneficio cognitivo.
So we know that students who are bilingual or who are multilingual can really think oftentimes outside the box because they can think about things from different angles. Eso es tan importante porque esa flexibilidad, esa creatividad, ellos van a necesitar para todas sus vidas.
In my mind, the benefits are cognitive, social, and economic.
No podemos votar por lo nuestro.
There's all kinds of different benefits that have been researched about the vocabulary that you build in 2 languages as opposed to just one, how flexible and malleable your brain is. To me, it's more about humanity and how we are able to step in somebody else's shoes and see the world how they see it.
One thing that makes Fort River so special is that we have so many teachers and so many adults that are involved within each classroom. So you'll see, reading specialists working with students and math specialists and ELL teachers and the classroom teacher. So it really is viewed as like all kids are our kids and we're all working together to meet the needs of all of our learners.
For most of our teachers, being bilingual has impacted their personal life in a significant way when they really bring that with them here and help inspire the young people.
Over the years, I've gone through doubts of like, oh, well, I don't know that much Spanish, so maybe I'm not exactly bilingual, but now, as I've gotten older, I've embraced my culture and who I am. I'm like, oh, I'm bilingual because I speak Spanish and I speak English and I am open to any culture.
We want them to feel that they can have a world perspective about life, which I think is really crucial in this day and age for our young people.
Wow, that was really powerful. I especially loved hearing that young lady saying, I've embraced my culture. That's completely powerful, in my opinion, at least. So anyhow, now I'd like to introduce y'all to the chairs of MABE's Advocacy Committee, Dr. Rabia Hos and Dr. Laura Hamman-Ortiz. Dr. Hos is an associate professor of TESOL bilingual dual language education. She has done extensive work focusing on education of newcomer immigrants and refugees with interrupted and inconsistent formal education, or SLIFE, in Germany, Turkey, and the United States. Her extensive research on newcomer immigrant and refugee multilingual learners is grounded in her life experience of being a newcomer in the high school in the United States, being an ESOL teacher in U.S. public schools, and educating teachers of MLLs in higher education and collaborating with educators across the globe during the past 2 decades. Dr. Laura Hamman-Ortiz is an assistant professor of TESOL and bilingual education at the University of Rhode Island. Her research explores how to cultivate equity-oriented and linguistically expansive learning spaces for emergent bilinguals, especially through translanguage pedagogies. She's a former 2nd grade and high school English teacher and has worked in teacher education for over a decade. She chairs the Advocacy Committee within the MABE board and is also on the executive board of Nuestro Mundo Charter School in Providence, Rhode Island. As y'all hear Rabia and Laura, as well as our others, as well as our other speakers today, please think about our earlier definitions of advocacy and how you can advocate for dual language education. Rabia and Laura, they're all yours.
Thank you, Aradhana.
Thanks, Aradhana. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's so great to be here with you today, and it is truly inspirational to see so many different bilingual education advocates here from across the country. So thank you for joining us. Rabia and I are going to be sharing our white paper, which is hot off the press, just came out this week, and we hope you will take some time to look through it if you haven't already. But today we're going to be summarizing some of the key ideas in the white paper. In it, we put forth a proposal for how to cultivate and expand the bilingual educator workforce in Rhode Island, both to serve the growing multilingual learner student population and to foster more multilingualism in our state. I want to emphasize that it is the product of many collaborations with school and state leaders in Rhode Island, and has been a collaboration with both MABE and EMMA, Educators for Multilingual Multicultural America. And Rabia and I are so grateful for everyone who contributed to the paper, especially our co-authors, Jimmy Cahan, Joan LaChance, Phyllis Hardy, and Aaron Papa, and everybody who provided feedback and suggestions as we were working on it over the last year and a half. And so we're hopeful that this white paper and today's session can help us to think about potential bilingual teacher pathways, both within the state of Rhode Island and around the country, so we can work together to find solutions to grow and support the bilingual teacher workforce. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Rabia Hos.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time on a Friday morning to be with us today. And thank you, everyone who contributed to the white paper. We'll first begin by providing a brief overview of the current demographics of multilingual learners nationwide and statewide in Rhode Island. As we're all aware, MLLs account for more than 10% of the total K-12 student population nationwide. With the increasing numbers of mobility, it's estimated that the number of MLLs will rise to as much as 40% by 2050. This number is also reflected locally, and MLLs currently comprise 16% of the students in the state of Rhode Island. To address the needs of the increasing numbers of MLLs, RIDE, dedicated to enhancing the support through Rhode Island's Strategic Plan for Multilingual Learner Success. The Rhode Island Strategic Plan also identifies bilingual dual language education as a key model for serving the growing population of MLLs. If you can go to the next slide. So the impetus for this white paper originated from insightful discussions and collaborative advocacy efforts during our meetings that we had with the Rhode Island Bilingual Dual Language Network that we created last year in 2022, fall of 2022. We got together with a team of teachers, administrators, and community stakeholders to engage in a dialogue around ways how we can collaborate and foster collective impact to improve current practices in bilingual schools and expand bilingualism in Rhode Island. As we discussed the strengths and challenges faced by our community of bilingual educators, they were not isolated. They were shared, echoing a call for unified action. Recognizing the importance of informed decision-making, the discussions originally led to the necessity for robust data. Thus, a team of us at RIORI started the study mapping the state of bilingual education in Rhode Island. As we engaged in collecting data from the educators in dual language schools in Rhode Island, we also wanted to address another key area that surfaced during these discussions: the critical need for bolstering teacher recruitment efforts within the bilingual dual language education in Rhode Island. Identifying this shared challenge prompted us to examine our strategies collectively and envision innovative approaches to attract and retain skilled educators passionate about MLLs. As part of our advocacy efforts in the MABE Advocacy Committee, we started to draft this white paper that was informed by research literature and mapped out the challenges, opportunities, and recommendations for different stakeholders so that each of us can commit to an action step toward cultivating and expanding the bilingual education network in Rhode Island and beyond. As we unfold the contents of this white paper, we invite you to join us in this journey towards a more collaborative, impactful, and data-driven approach to bilingual dual language education in Rhode Island and beyond. Next, Laura.
Thank you. So we begin in the white paper and begin, as we just saw in the beautiful video that Randana shared, talking about what Thomas and Collier have called the astounding effectiveness of bilingual education. I know with this audience, we probably don't need to talk too much about this image, which has become so well known in our field. It's sometimes just called the chart. But we know from not only Thomas and Collier's research, but research by many others that bilingual education is by far the most effective model for supporting multilingual learners in terms of their academic achievement and their English language development, and of course, for maintaining and developing their home language. We know that MLLs in bilingual programs consistently outperform their peers in other program models, and sometimes even outperform native English speakers on a range of measures. And yet, despite the clear efficacy of these models, we know from research that Erin Papa has done that as of in 2020, only 3% of Rhode Island students were currently being served by bilingual programs. So we know that this model works. We have plenty of research showing that it does, but it continues to be a model that is only available for a few students. Next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. And so one of the challenges, of course, in maintaining and growing programs in bilingual programs in Rhode Island and around the country is the shortage of bilingual programs. We know this is not a challenge that is isolated to our state. And we know it's also not just a challenge that's being faced in bilingual spaces, right? So we know nationally there are teacher shortages. There's a recent survey that was conducted by the National Center for Education Statistics in 2022 found that more than half of public schools in the country reported being understaffed at the start of the 2022 school year. So we know that this is a challenge broadly speaking as well. And in that survey, school leaders reported that the primary challenge that they faced for filling vacancies was too few candidates that were applying for open teaching positions, followed closely by the lack of qualified candidates. And there are particularly acute shortages, excuse me, in the area of ESOL and bilingual ed, especially in the Northeast. So we know that based on the survey, 37% of public schools in the Northeast reported that they were understaffed in that area in ESOL or bilingual ed. We don't have comprehensive data on teacher shortages in Rhode Island, but we do know something about the scope of the problem based on trends in emergency certificate issuance. So when districts can't find fully licensed teachers for a position, they can request an emergency certificate be issued to an individual who doesn't yet hold a full certificate in whatever area, whether it's initial licensure or a more advanced certificate like ESOL or TESOL or bilingual ed. And we can see from this chart from the Bellwether report in 2022 that over the last few years, the number of emergency certificates being issued in the state of Rhode Island has dramatically increased by 180% between 2014 and 2021. So it is worth noting, as some have mentioned, that emergency certifications can be a viable strategy for growing the teacher workforce and diversifying the teacher workforce because it does allow individuals with diverse backgrounds to begin to enter into classrooms and begin the process of becoming an educator. But we also caution against relying upon this process too heavily. And we strongly recommend that the state invest in reorganizing resources so we can increase the number of certified bilingual educators from the onset of their teaching. So I'll turn it back over to Rabia to talk a little bit about how we might strengthen this pipeline.
So not to say that we have a wealth of linguistic resources in Rhode Island. So we're really fortunate. As of 2021, 22% of the Rhode Island's population age 5 and older speaks a language other than English. And the largest subpopulation within this group is working age adults, 18 to 64, of whom approximately speak 24% a language other than English. So this untapped resource is a significant opportunity for growing the bilingual teacher workforce in the state. Many bilingual adults already are working in schools, although they might be working in schools without a BDL program or as teacher assistants or paraprofessionals because they don't yet have certification to teach in Rhode Island. Since finding the bilingual teachers in the US is a challenge, many BDL programs around the country have turned to outsourcing bilingual teachers from other countries too. Despite the efforts in trying to capitalize on the wealth of our bilingual community, there are many systemic challenges when it comes to cultivating the bilingual teacher pathways at all levels, specifically at the higher ed levels that we're trying to grapple with. So building pathways within our K-12 and institutions of higher ed to recruit, train, and certified bilingual students is essential to addressing the shortage of bilingual teachers. Next, Laura will begin. We'll discuss 3 real stories of individuals who have sought to become bilingual educators in the US. So I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thanks, Rabia. So in the white paper, we present these 3 case studies as well, and we wanted to share them with you today because we do think it helps to have some real life examples to concretize, to help us think more concretely about the challenges that are encountered by bilingual individuals who are trying to obtain their certification to teach in a bilingual classroom. In these stories, we've changed the names of the individuals to protect their privacy, but the details of their stories remain true. So the first case study we'll share is Alicia's story, and this is a story of moving from teacher's assistant to classroom teacher. For 18 years, Alicia worked as a teacher's assistant in a kindergarten Spanish classroom at International Charter School in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. During this time, she consistently engaged in professional development, and she developed her expertise as an educator. After working for 18 years as a TA in 2019, with the encouragement of the assistant director, she decided to embark on the journey to become a classroom teacher. She already held a bachelor's in business administration from the Dominican Republic, but she had not taken the requisite courses to become a certified classroom teacher in Rhode Island. So in the fall of 2020, she entered Rhode Island College full-time in order to pursue a bachelor's in early childhood education and a certificate in dual language education. Since the program is not designed for those who hold full-time jobs, her classes were held in the middle of the day, which meant she had to take personal time to attend class. She also had to complete all of her coursework in English, which is not her native language. Nevertheless, Alicia worked diligently on her degree while also working as a second grade Spanish side teacher. She paid for the coursework herself, never missing a day of work and always working to the expectations of the position, and all during the COVID-19 pandemic. In May 2022, she graduated summa cum laude. Now, while Alicia's story is inspirational, it also offers some important insights into the challenges faced by aspiring bilingual educators and how we might address these challenges for future teachers. First, the cost of her coursework could have been supplemented by the state or the district, which might have helped Alicia pursue the certification earlier. Second, the coursework could have been offered in Spanish and with more flexible hours to accommodate practicing teachers. Bilingual paraprofessionals in Rhode Island are a tremendous asset to our community, and they could be a powerful resource for growing the bilingual teacher workforce. Next slide, please, Laura.
Now we turn to Sandra's story, from teacher to janitor. So Sandra is an experienced elementary teacher who taught in Venezuela prior to immigrating to the US. Upon moving to Rhode Island, Sandra wanted to teach in a bilingual setting to support MLLs. However, she was not yet confident enough with her English or her knowledge of the process for becoming a teacher, so she started working in schools as a janitor to have some exposure to the US school system. Eventually, through word of mouth, she was connected with the credential review pathway at Rhode Island College. Since she was certified as a teacher in Venezuela, the CRP director referred her to RIDE for the initial elementary educator certification and helped connect Sandra with an open elementary bilingual position. However, after conducting a transcript review, RIDE was not satisfied with her Venezuelan credentials. Therefore, Sandra was referred back to RIC's credential review pathway. Fortunately, the RIC reviewer concluded that her Venezuelan preparation was equivalent to the elementary educator coursework, leaving only the practice for elementary education as the remaining requirement for initial certification. It should be noted that this praxis test is a significant hurdle for a bilingual teacher still acquiring English and the cultural knowledge necessary to pass the test. As a result, Sandra is currently working as a long-term substitute teacher in a dual language classroom as she prepares for the praxis and continuous coursework in bilingual dual language education so that she can be certified to teach in US bilingual contexts. So Sandra's story highlights how capable and experienced bilingual educators can face serious barriers of entry to fill the many vacancies in the state. Despite being a certified and experienced teacher in Venezuela, Sandra spent many years working as a janitor in local schools and is still facing many barriers to becoming fully certified to remain teaching in her own classroom. There are important takeaways from this story. First, RIDE should honor certification from other countries rather than sending teachers back and forth to credential review pathway offices in institutions of higher education. Second, alternatives to the praxis exams should be offered to allow international teachers to become fully certified based on holistic assessment of performance in the classroom as an alternative to one-time test. Now we'll turn over to the next story, Laura.
Thank you. Thanks, Phyllis. All right, so the final case study is the story of an international teacher, Roberto, coming from Peru to the United States. Roberto was credentialed as a high school science teacher in Peru. He taught in a Peruvian high school for 7 years prior to coming to the US to teach in a dual language program. Based on the Peruvian educational system, he was qualified to teach chemistry, physics, and environmental science in Spanish in a US middle school setting. Roberto was hired to teach science in the US through a private teacher recruitment service on a temporary 3-year contract. The services were expensive, and while Roberto wasn't expensive for some of the fees, it was made clear to him that his salary would be less in the US than what he earned in Peru. Roberto arrived in the US shortly before beginning the school year and was issued an emergency teaching license. Despite being an experienced teacher, Roberto struggled with many of the differences between teaching in the US and Peru. For example, he was unclear about the importance of standardized testing and the pressure his colleagues expressed about students' results. He was also unaccustomed to the level of student-centered teaching and learning he was expected to deliver, given his previous experience with more teacher-directed instruction. Furthermore, Roberto was surprised by how frequently students were pulled from his classroom for special services, which made them miss substantial amounts of class time. For these reasons and more, Roberto, an experienced and highly qualified teacher, required 2 full school years to become proficient in his role. Given that his contract was limited to 3 years, Roberto had only just learned the ropes by the time he needed to return to Peru. So what can we learn from Roberto's story? International teachers undoubtedly contribute many linguistic and cultural assets to bilingual programs that enrich the learning community. Yet there are many challenges with international teachers, including a costly and time-intensive hiring process and substantive investment in training and support for an educator who will then have to leave after a few years. Therefore, one important takeaway is that there's a great need to increase the bilingual teacher pipeline within the United States. Temporarily hiring international teachers should not be the primary solution to the bilingual teacher shortage. At the same time, international teachers can and should be part of growing the bilingual teacher workforce and would benefit from more formalized professional development support, both when they arrive and throughout their time in the US, to ensure their success teaching in a new context. Phyllis, can you go to the next slide, please? So with those stories in mind, we're going to transition now to highlighting some specific challenges, opportunities, and recommendations for growing and supporting the bilingual teacher workforce in Rhode Island. And we'll start with the challenges, which reflect some of the challenges that we just mentioned in those stories. We've organized our discussion of challenges following Conor Williams and his colleague Zavala's framing in a 2023 report on how to grow the bilingual teacher pathways across the U.S. And in their article, they identify 3 primary pressures that are impacting the national shortage of bilingual teachers: financial, logistical, and linguistic. And to these 3, we've added pedagogical, acknowledging the need for enhanced professional training to support bilingual educators, particularly those on international teaching visas. And while we see each of these as separate challenges, we also want to emphasize that many potential bilingual teachers experience aspects of all 4 of these challenges to varying degrees. So first, we have financial challenges. One major barrier for those who are seeking bilingual certification is cost. There are application fees that students need to pay for when they enter into programs of higher ed to pursue their certification. We've already talked about praxis tests. So to be able to pay for the tests that are required, initial licensure tests, the ESOL test, those can be quite costly. And many times, because those tests are offered in English only, teachers may have to take them over and over, which is an additional cost. And of course, the cost of coursework that's required for teachers to take courses to be able to gain that certification. Another set of challenges is logistical, and you heard some of that in the case studies as well. There is a long process of reciprocity for many teachers that they encounter that often requires them to take additional coursework as they're teaching under emergency licensure, despite many of them having existing qualifications and experiences. So thinking about how we can address some of those challenges is important. And we also have a time restriction for international teachers. There's limited pathways for international teachers to be able to remain in the US once the duration of their visa is up. Additionally, linguistic challenges remain a pressing issue. Certification and credentialing exams, as I noted, are available in English only, and bilingual teachers are required to take their certification exams in English, even if they exclusively teach in the non-English partner language, Spanish or Portuguese, or whatever the language is. This lack of availability of assessments in languages other than English can lead many bilingual or international teachers to spend a lot of time and money preparing for and retaking these assessments in English when they could easily meet the content and knowledge requirements if the assessments were available in their native languages or if there were alternative forms of assessment. And finally, pedagogical challenges. There's limited bilingual education-specific professional development, despite the fact that it is a specialized skill set that is required to teach in a bilingual setting. And Dr. Michael Guerrero will be speaking more about that today. Teaching students academic content in two languages, we know, extends beyond just having proficiency in the instructional language. You need to have knowledge of holistic biliteracy development. And I was excited to see Kathy Escamilla is joining us. So I know she has spent a lot of her career focusing on that. Translanguaging pedagogies, effective collaboration techniques, which Joan LaChance has worked on quite extensively. So we know that there is much more that, that teachers need to know in order to teach effectively in a bilingual dual language setting. So there's a need for improved pedagogical training specific to bilingual education for both local and international teachers. There's also currently no requirement in our state that bilingual certification programs be aligned with the National Dual Language Education Teacher Preparation Standards. Most states are currently just aligning their programs with TESOL, which can lead to gaps in the competencies that teachers need to demonstrate for successfully teaching in bilingual settings. So those are some of the challenges. I'm going to turn it over to Rabia to talk about some of the opportunities we see in the state of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Laura. So while there are significant challenges, we can talk around challenges all day long, right? There are also many opportunities that are already in place in Rhode Island to support the development and expansion of bilingual teacher workforce. So many school districts in Rhode Island are already defraying costs for teachers to obtain training and certification to effectively start MLLs. A lot of districts have been providing support for teachers to attain their certification. Thanks to the advocacy of the Coalition for Multilingual RI in collaboration with the state legislators, there's also a funding stream to support multilingual adults through Rhode Island Reconnect, a program that aims to help Rhode Island adults to finish college or change careers. Multilingual adults can now access up to $5,000 of non-academic support in technology, gas, groceries to help them gain certification in bilingual education, world language education, and or special education. There are also existing pathways towards certification in bilingual education at two universities within the state, Rhode Island College and University of Rhode Island. We both offer coursework for bilingual educators in the range of competencies and knowledge bases needed for effective bilingual dual language program implementation. There are many existing professional development supports for bilingual educators. Teachers in Rhode Island can participate in a variety of professional development offerings through the Multi-State Association for Bilingual Education, a regional organization with deep expertise in BDL. MABE has been instrumental in the region in supporting the establishment and expansion of successful dual language programs, so it's an asset. There's also support for international teachers, such as the recently established International Teachers Project that aims to address the national teacher shortage through the recruitment of qualified international teachers via a J-1 visa program for 3 to 5 years. There are also models for strengthening the bilingual teacher workforce that could be developed in our state by learning about those that have been successfully developed and implemented across in our region and beyond. We currently have, next slide, please. 2 bilingual teacher pathway programs in Rhode Island, but there are many more in the neighboring states and across the nation, and we share this at the end of our white paper. So as it's evident, there are many promising initiatives already underway. The first one is the TA to BA program that Central Falls School District offers, and the International Teachers Project that is led by Dr. Victor Capean. So these are both promising practices that are going to be supporting the bilingual teacher pathway in our state. Next slide, please. As it's evident, there are lots of initiatives underway in the state that will help grow the bilingual teacher workforce in Rhode Island. However, they are insufficient to address the many challenges to building a robust statewide bilingual education system and meeting the needs of the growing multilingual learner population. We now would like to close with a series of recommendations and next steps for different stakeholders to help Rhode Island cultivate and expand the bilingual workforce it needs. So the first recommendations are for district and state education leaders. We would like to recommend that district and state education leaders should continue and expand efforts to subsidize costs for teachers to obtain ESOL and BDL certification. We would like the district and state education leaders to offer additional financial incentives for individuals to pursue BDL certifications, such as covering the cost of certification, licensing exams, signing bonuses. We also would like district and state education leaders to identify bilingual teachers not currently teaching in BDL programs and incentivize their switching to teaching in BDL programs. We would like to recommend to streamline the reciprocity of certification between Rhode Island and other states and countries, such as Puerto Rico. It's interesting that even certifications from Puerto Rico don't have reciprocity. We also would like to recommend to develop additional opportunities for professional development for bilingual educators in collaboration with expert organizations such as MABE and institutions of higher education. We would like to recommend to establish clear criteria for assessing the qualifications of incoming international teachers, considering factors such as educational background, teaching experience, and references. And final recommendation for state and district leaders is to implement mentorship programs to pair new bilingual teachers and international teachers with experienced bilingual educators to provide guidance and support during the initial stages of their teaching careers in U.S. bilingual classrooms. Now, I'll turn it over to Laura to discuss the recommendations for policymakers next.
Thanks, Rabia. So for policymakers, we have three primary recommendations. The first, and I think most important, is to formalize funding mechanisms for teachers to obtain BDL or ESOL certification by passing legislation such as the Bilingual Educator Act and the Multilingual Educators Investment Act, both of which were proposed in the 2023 legislative session and are being proposed again in the 2024 session. And Dr. Aaron Papa and all of the members of the Coalition for a Multilingual Rhode Island have been instrumental in putting that legislation together and really advocating for it. So we need to pass it. We need to have a dedicated funding stream for bilingual education and bilingual educators. Related to that is increasing the funding for in-service teacher professional development supports, including for international educators and those on emergency licensures. And finally, to develop a working group to examine findings from some surveys that are currently underway by both Emma and the Coalition for Multilingual Rhode Island to help us inform the design or the redesign of our certification processes for bilingual educators in the state. And Rabia, back to you for higher ed.
Thank you. For us at the institutions of higher ed, some of the recommendations that we have are to continue to partner with districts and state education leaders to ensure that, excuse me, BDL and ESOL certification programs are meeting the needs of working teachers. Next is to develop additional pathways and funding streams to support bilingual undergraduates and graduate students pursuing BDL and ESOL certification. Most importantly, expanding bilingual education offerings and aligning bilingual dual language teacher education programs with Emma's National Dual Language Teacher Education Preparation Standards, and work with school and district leaders to develop a comprehensive orientation and training program for international teachers to familiarize candidates with local education policies, curriculum standards, and classroom management practices. So as we conclude this presentation on the white paper, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude for your engagement, commitment, and shared vision in advancing bilingual dual language education in Rhode Island and beyond. We hope that together, we're laying the foundation for a future that will proudly say that we're all teachers of multilingual learners, where we can capitalize on the strengths of our local community and commit to an action step toward growing and sustaining dual language programs. Thank you. Gracias. Teşekkürler.
Thank you, Rabia and Laura, for clearly outlining the challenges, opportunities, and recommendations with bilingual teacher shortages in Rhode Island. We're going to take a 5-minute stretch because we know sitting down from Zoom is a long and difficult challenge for us. So let's all come back at 9:57. Dr. Michael Guerrero earned his doctorate in educational linguistics at the University of New Mexico. He has prepared bilingual educators in Texas for over 25 years. He's currently a full professor in the Department of Bilingual and Literacy Studies at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He is actively engaged in developing a national dual language certificate based on the standards for preparing dual language facilitators using a trainer of trainers model. Dr. Guerrero and his colleague, Dr. Joan LaChance, are the founders of Emma and the authors of the National Dual Language Education Teacher Preparation Standards. Michael.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to be here with you virtually Never been out this way. So thank you. I can see there's a lot of commitment. I can see there's a great deal of enthusiasm and hard work going on. And I'm glad to be a part of what's going on today. I have some thoughts that I'd like to share with you about how Emma is addressing this teacher crisis that we're experiencing in bilingual education, and in particular, two-way and one-way immersion programs. Program growth across 44 states is steady, but the availability, as we've seen earlier today, of well-prepared dual language teachers is lagging behind. So clearly we have a crisis, but Emma has been responding by creating what I like to call a new space and tools that can help alleviate part of the crises. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about us. Probably know that Dr. Joan LaChance is the director of Emma, and I serve as a co-director. And Mr. David Rogers, the past executive director of Dual Language Education New Mexico, assists us in our activities as a senior advisor. And basically, in 2021, Emma emerged as a new space tucked under and into Dual Language Education of New Mexico. Dual Language Education New Mexico is the mothership. Emma is a new component of Dual Language Education New Mexico, and everything we do essentially revolves around the standards we published in 2018. These standards, the first of their kind, represent the main tool. Next slide, please. So in creating this space and tool and realizing we couldn't do much alone, we created and are continuing to create a consortium of like-minded organizations and entities that are dedicated to bilingual education in general, and two-way and one-way immersion programs in particular. So collaboration, as we know, can be a very powerful vehicle for social transformation. The members of the consortium consist of NIELPA, which basically is an association, national association consisting of Title III directors. We're working closely also with WIDA and YSEP out of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And of course, we're also working in partnership with MABE Northeast. And we've been provided with strategic financial support through the Thornburg Foundation in New Mexico. Basically, our activities revolve around two main objectives. First, we want everyone to know about the standards. We want state education agencies to know about them. We want universities to know about them. And we want local education agencies to know about them. At the same time, we're engaged in moving forward on the establishment of what's called a specialized professional association, or a SPA, under CAPE, which stands for Council for Accreditation of Educator Preparation. CAPE approved our application in 2021 to establish the very first SPA aimed specifically at dual language bilingual education teacher preparation, and what we see also as an additional tool for our work. And keep in mind that a SPA must be established on a set of vetted standards. There are other professional organizations that have SPAs under CAPE, like the National Council for the Teachers of English, the National Council for the Teachers of Mathematics, the National Association for the Education of Young Children. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with those national organizations. And this would include TESOL, which I'll be talking about a little more in a few moments. One of our other main activities that we're engaged in is the development of what has already been mentioned, the National Dual Language Certificate for the preparation facilitators using a trainer-trainers model. The certificate, of course, would be anchored to the national standards that I'm here to talk about today. And again, the certificate represents yet another tool for addressing the dual language teacher shortage and their preparation, especially once they're in the classroom. So next slide, please. Just to give you a quick idea about the evolution of national standards in the US related to bilingual education. As some of you know, maybe if you've been around as long as I have, one of the earliest iterations of standards of this kind was generated by the Center for Applied Linguistics in 1974. And maybe some of you are familiar with this little document. Maybe not. Maybe before your time. Even so, it is one of the earliest iterations of standards of this kind, and it was generated by the Center for Applied Linguistics in 1974. Okay. Interestingly, these guidelines were basically generated during a 2-day conference and were authored by about a dozen bilingual education scholars. And if you look carefully, you can see remnants of what we still practice today in terms of standards and competencies for our bilingual education teachers. It's 6 pages long and has no references. Now, fast forward to 1992, about 20 years later, and MABE developed and published professional standards for the preparation of bilingual multicultural teachers. And that's this document that some of you might be familiar with. Okay. And as everyone was speaking earlier, and as I thought about what I was going to be sharing with you today, I got this great idea, and any one of you are welcome to take it and run with it. We need a museum of bilingual education. It would be fabulous, okay, where we could archive all kinds of interesting things, right? So, MABE generated these standards, and this particular document, and I know Kathy's online with us, so correct me if I'm wrong at some point. But the document was generated primarily by 6 scholars, 6 experts of bilingual education, and basically consists of a series of 6 standards. And the document is approximately 23 pages long and has no references. But what is particularly significant about the document is that Dr. Escamilla, president of MABE at the time, indicated very clearly that what MABE should be aiming towards was establishing national standards for the preparation of bilingual education teachers that could be incorporated into some kind of a national accreditation process. So, approximately 20 years later, in 2012, a researcher advocate of bilingual education, Dr. Nevares La Torre in New York, published a short intro to a volume of the Journal of Multilingual Education Research. And I try to keep track of these kinds of things, and I just happened to come across this one recently. And in her comments, she states, I encountered that key national and international professional organizations in the area of language education, TESOL and ACTFL, have professional teacher standards. However, none especially address the expertise needed by educators who teach in bilingual education programs. So, in my mind, this comment is significant, as it again points to the need for national standards for the preparation of dual language bilingual education teachers. I think we're all aware that because there have not been any national standards for bilingual education teachers, that the policy and practice for states has been, and colleges of education and bilingual ed preparation programs, has been to lean on the TESOL standards for the preparation of our teachers. including in-service opportunities for practicing bilingual education teachers in dual language programs. So if you look closely at the TESOL standards published in 2019, these are the 5 standards that are outlined: knowledge about language, ELLs in the social cultural context, planning and implementing instruction, assessment and evaluation, professionalism, and leadership. So I was asked to make a comment about why these standards are not sufficient for our purposes. And so one of the first things that I did was to do a word search for the word bilingual. And if I'm not mistaken, the B word is not used even once in the document. And that's probably a good enough reason for us to look to the EMA standards to alleviate the teacher crisis. Next slide, please. So if you look at the standards that Dr. LaChance and I helped put together with a lot of help, this was about a 3-year process. This was not just Joan and I sitting down and crashing them out. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of heated debate, a lot of tension around what these standards ought to look like. And all this took place over approximately a 3-year period. So through at least 3 pre-conference institutes hosted by Dual Language Education of New Mexico during La Cosecha conferences, and multiple Zoom meetings with representatives from around the country, as well as taking iterations of the standards to major conferences like AERA and GABE for feedback, the end result were these 6 standards that you see here on this slide. Basically, we'd like to believe that they represent a synthesis of 3 decades of theory, research, and practice that can be used to create better policy for the preparation of dual language bilingual education teachers. The standards rest on nearly 3 decades of what we know about the effectiveness of these programs. And just so you know, the word bilingual is found on 52 of the 74 pages of the standards document. Each of these standards are broken down into 3 or 4 smaller components, and then each of these components is broken down into subcomponents. So it's a detailed kind of blueprint, and it captures a lot, but it doesn't capture everything. No set of standards ever will. The standards are 83 pages long and include references, bibliography supporting each of the standards. Since their publication, the standards have been vetted by CAPE and educators in Washington State, Massachusetts, and the University of Maryland for different purposes. Now, the standards are already 5 years old, and so clearly there's a need to update them, and we'll update the standards and the references as we move forward with the development of the National Certificate for the Trainer of Trainers initiative. So, as we see this certificate, it will provide the most expedient form of relief for the teacher crisis that states need not develop their own, saving them maybe a year, maybe 2 years, or 3 years to develop, write their own, vet them, vote on them, and put them into play. So we do see that the certificate is going to immediately address this teacher crisis that we're talking about, as well as the credentialing issues that were discussed earlier. In the case of Washington State, the timing just coincided. They were looking to develop their own standards for the preparation of dual language teachers, and we published that around the same time, and hence began the vetting process of the standards. They didn't have to write anything. And in fact, they adopted the standards in full. So you can see our standards are relatively similar to TESOL in terms of, if we did do a side-by-side comparison, but you know, yeah, as I point out, bilingual is an essential concept within our standards. And next slide, please. Yeah, what also sets our standards apart from, I would say, all state standards that exist. I believe the state of Oregon developed some standards just before we published ours. And in their standards, they don't make a direct reference to critical consciousness, but they do make a direct reference to social justice. But there was a challenge that Joan and I faced as we were developing and trying to push these forward. And I think, as most of you know, over the last decade, there's been this emergence of a critique about the effectiveness of these programs, about the astounding effectiveness of these programs. And so, you know, the way it basically goes is that these programs are beginning to take more interest in meeting the needs of the native English-speaking children, as opposed to the emergent bilingual children for whom these programs were originally designed. This echoes clearly with Guadalupe Valdez and her cautionary note that she set forth in the mid-1990s, asking the field whether or not a single approach could serve two very different communities of students. And it has come to roost. And as you know, it is an issue that we have to grapple with in the field. These critical pedagogues are basically making the case, and rightfully so, that the teachers, students, parents, and administrators are not critically conscious enough. That they need to be more critically conscious in order to identify and address what can be considered inequities, where native English-speaking students' interests are put ahead of emergent bilingual children's. We were able to take this into careful account as we wrote up our standards. And I just wanted to point out that we're not only responding to the teacher crisis, but we're also responding to the critics of dual language programming and their call for greater critical consciousness among program stakeholders. You know, as far as I can tell, all the stakeholders are doing the very best that they can. In fairness to the teachers, who prepared them? We need to ask ourselves that important question. Maybe professors weren't critically conscious enough themselves as they prepared them. Maybe we too should embrace a little bit of discomfort. You can see on the slide, I quickly highlight how each standard is infused what can be considered a critical consciousness related component. There is no standalone standard for critical consciousness. Rather, critical consciousness is infused throughout the 6 standards into their very foundation. What we've done is blended best practices with critical consciousness. And just to be clear, critical consciousness has to do with the teachers and everyone's ability to recognize disparities and inequalities and inequities in the school and the program, and then to act on them, to correct them, which is not always an easy thing to do, especially when you're talking about issues like gentrification or privileging white students over BIPOC students. Last slide, please. So in closing, I'd like to think about Emma as opening a new space and the standards as a new social tool that is long overdue. Together, they represent a tangible way forward for addressing the teacher crisis at hand. Emma stands with MABE Northeast and the rest of the country in sharing the responsibility for the current state of affairs. And we are here to collaborate and to advocate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I was listening so intently that I forgot to pay attention to the slide changing. So now we'll hear from Dr. Conor Williams, who's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and a partner at the Children's Equity Project. His research focuses on policies and structures that determine multilingual learners' access to quality educational opportunities. Dr. Williams began his career as a first grade teacher.
Hey, folks. Thanks again, everyone, for having me. I'm really grateful to be here today. And having listened now to the presenters coming before me, I want to clarify one thing here, because I think you're going to hear a lot of alignment, and I want to, even some repetition, I want to explain why I think that's the case. I work as a policy researcher. My job is to, there's a technical phrase that came out of a book some years ago. My job is to see like a state. And what that means is to look at something, a former teacher, 3 children in Title I public schools in Washington, D.C. I know that a school is effervescent, it's organic, it's a learning community full of relationships and meaning and vibrancy. But if you look at it like a state, what you see are funding streams. You see structures. You see conditional accountability, that in exchange for these Title I dollars, you give this test, we measure the data this way. And so what I'm going to try to do today is take something as complicated and organic and important as teacher diversity and bilingual teacher shortages and show you how to look at it like a state. How do you look at it in terms of structures, in terms of potential solutions, in terms of amendments and reforms to structures that could actually shift the way that we hire, train, and retain bilingual teachers. So let's move on to the first slide. How do you look at bilingual teacher shortages as a policy puzzle? We'll go through these bullet by bullet. Go ahead and move on forward. How do we train teachers? Who do we require, or what do we require to become a teacher, a bilingual teacher? Well, you need to have a bachelor's degree, you need to do your student teaching, you need to have a teaching license, keep going. You need to pass the, as we've been hearing, usually English only licensure exam. And what do we actually see in terms of how that constrains supply? How do these structures affect who gets to be a teacher, a bilingual teacher? Well, BAs are expensive. They're not flexible. And, you know, again, there's in the parentheses there, you'll see we've done some cutting of census data recently, and we found that, you know, poverty rates are higher for 18 to 25-year-olds who are speaking non-English languages at home than they are for English-only families and English-only adults. So we know that these are unique challenges that hit linguistically diverse teacher candidates in specific ways. Next slide, please. And again, seeing like a state. One of the things that's the most challenging, oh, sorry, is this the slide?
Next slide. It's not forwarding for me. I'm not sure why. Let me just try again a different way.
Just what?
Here we go. Is this it?
Good. Yep, go ahead. So there are 2 different fields of research here that shape how we think about these things as a policy puzzle. We have these credentials that we require, and we know what it does to the supply of teacher candidates that we get. The credentials that we require have a very mixed track record as far as their ability to actually accurately reflect high quality instruction and better outcomes for kids. There's some evidence, depending on exactly which credential you're measuring and in particular states, some evidence that sometimes, yes, teacher passing scores on teacher licensure exams seem to produce a mild improvement in teacher quality and in student outcomes. And then in some cases, we find the opposite. One thing that we have as a relatively consistent finding, though, in the research is that the way that we set these structures up is almost always constraining to teacher diversity and including, but not limited to, linguistic diversity. Next slide, please.
Oops, sorry.
No trouble. So then, very simply, let's think about this the way that a state would look at it. How would you then address this problem? That you have these credentials that are baked into the how you prepare teachers. You're not sure if they actually produce better teaching. Again, we have very limited evidence on that. But we are sure that it's keeping a lot of bilingual teachers out. Well, so what do? One option is you say, okay, let's take these traditional training programs, these credentials that we require, and let's see if we can make them more affordable, more flexible, ways that we can get people through these programs so that, and these exams, so that they're more accessible to linguistically diverse candidates. So cohort approaches are one option, where you say you take all of the multilingual paraprofessionals who have similar educational backgrounds in their home countries or in the United States, all of them in your district, and you work with your local community college, your local regional university, something like that. You get them into a specific cohort of classes that they all take together. You give them targeted supports that are designed to meet the unique needs they mostly all have. You try to use that as a way to build some solidarity and some resource support to get them through. Bullet 2 is probably the not that secret silver bullet, the one that matters the most. Tuition support and fellowships, anything you can do to bring down cost is almost always the biggest lever in this space. And research is pretty clear on that. Similarly, really the same thing, right, is making sure that student teachers are being paid. In contexts where they're not being paid, they're often then being required to pay tuition to their Institute of Higher Education while working unpaid as a student teacher, and then often working an additional job on the side to try to make some kind of ends meet in that context. And finally, ways to make any ways you can find to make your traditional teacher training programs more flexible. That's always a good idea as well. Next slide, please. So option 2 is to say, look, we know that these traditional approaches to training teachers are kind of checkered. We just don't know if they work all that well, despite having them for a long time. The other version is to build some alternatives. You say, look, we're going to try to figure out ways, and in the report that was referenced that we wrote earlier, and I put a link in the chat a little while ago, the approach that you want to look for here is equivalency. You want to try to find things that can be recognized, skills, knowledge, capacities, abilities that bilingual teacher candidates already have or can already demonstrate, that can be treated as equivalent to some of these traditional proxy credentials, things like passing scores on the practice test, that might actually be better indicators of quality. So things like grow your own strategies, where you say, look, we're going to have you working already if you're a multilingual paraprofessional, or if you are a district staff who has a BA and some language proficiencies that we need. We'll set you into some kind of a scaled, scaffolded way to work in classrooms as an apprentice, to work in some sort of a residency model. Maybe you're taking some ongoing coursework at the local university as well, but we're going to design it in such a way that it's much less onerous for you than the usual traditional teacher training pathway. One of the most innovative versions I've ever seen is Bullet 2 in Portland Public Schools. They run some of the larger dual language programs of any district in that region. Portland Public Schools got tired of trying to bring in Vietnamese-speaking teachers and Russian-speaking teachers and Japanese-speaking teachers on J1 visas, and then losing them quickly over and over and over, just cycling through after 3 to 5 years. And they said, well, we're going to come up with this residency model. It'll be a provisional licensure model where if we have a bilingual, like I mentioned before, a bilingual staff member or bilingual community member who has a BA and has some experience working with children, we'll make them the teacher of record with a provisional license for up to, I think it's 4 or 5 years. We'll spend the summer preparing them with some intensive training to be the teacher of record, and then we'll coach them throughout their first couple of years while they also take classes at Portland State University at night, so that at the end of their provisional licensure period, then they can go up for full licensure and permanent licensure. And it's been, by all outward appearances, a really elegant and successful model for them in solving some relatively pronounced shortages they had. And again, I sort of launched right through it, but they offer immersion in course in Spanish, also in French, Russian, Vietnamese, Japanese, Mandarin. So they have a wide range of languages and a wide range of different bilingual teachers that they need to find. This has been a really useful way for them to solve it, working hand in glove with the state to establish this provisional license. There are other versions, and these it's sort of somewhat lesser power, but finding ways to get around the teacher licensure exam. Puerto Rico has its own teacher licensure exam in Spanish, and there's no reason that other states can't not just, again, obviously establish reciprocity with licensed teachers from Puerto Rico. But if you have teachers who you need to work in Spanish, who already have all the other credentials, and the only thing they're missing is the licensure exam, why not let them take a licensure exam in Spanish? And there's one right there. There's also, I think, a lot of worth in considering whether, certainly at the state level, there are options to overhaul how we do teacher licensure in the first place, saying, look, if we know that you have all of these skills already and you have all the credentials except for the teacher licensure exam, and because of your unique linguistic diversity, which is why we're so excited in hiring you, maybe there's a way for, in equivalency purposes, we can do a heightened number of observations in your classroom in your first year of teaching to confirm that you do in fact have the requisite skills and credentials, so that you don't have to go back and over again take this test. That, again, cannot stress enough, the research is very, very discouraging on whether these tests are actually predictive of better quality teaching. They just really aren't very successful, but we still require them. Why? We just do. Ongoing, also within alternative cohort models, it's important, while these can often be more cost efficient, you shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there may still be need to provide tuition support. And also when you're going to be working with regional universities or with local institutes of higher education, that you don't require extra coursework that isn't core to the actual work that teachers will be doing. Next slide, please. So some of this is just synthesizing what I said before. What can you do at the district level? Well, obviously, first and foremost, find ways to provide resource support, financial support to build your bilingual teacher pipeline. I keep saying it, I keep stressing it, and I'm going to just stress it one more time. There just isn't a path otherwise. We heard before, I think it was Alicia was the story we heard of a candidate who was taking personal time, taking courses during the day, who was making it work, but had to undergo really heavy amounts of financial strain to make it work. If that ends up being your model, if your approach to bilingual teacher training pipelines ends up being, well, we can't afford the resources, but we'll come up with some other clever stuff, just know that you are leaving a lot of teacher candidates on the table. You are not actually getting the full payoff that you could get if you put some resources in and invested in these folks. And then furthermore, towards the cohort model that I mentioned before, district leaders can try to figure out exactly what pathways they can build, either through local universities or alternative versions, so that they are really focused on making this fluid and streamlined for the folks that they've got. Next slide. So this is where the real work has to happen, because the work that you do at the state level, if we've got anybody on the call today, can really unshackle local and district leaders and institutes of higher education to advance the ball and to make it much easier to launch local experiments for their bilingual teaching candidates. The first bullet is a tough one. It's deceptively easy to say, well, just reform the licensure system so that the hurdles get out of the way. That's going to mean things like rethinking whether your licensure exam is necessary for all teachers, whether you need to create some sorts of licensure systems that can, again, create some equivalencies so that Spanish dominant or Portuguese dominant or Korean dominant teachers are able to get into your classrooms without having to pass this English only exam. The state has the resources usually to launch statewide grants programs that can start to build these pipelines in particular areas. And also the state has, I think, a lot of the levers they need for establishing both policy conditions, but also the actual investment to create alternative teacher certification programs as well. Next. Finally, if you look at our report, and I do hope you do, we made a special effort to talk to bilingual teacher candidates, much like the stories that you saw in the earlier presentation today. One of the things that stuck with me was one of the teacher candidates down in Gwinnett County Public Schools, which is just in the suburbs and exurbs of Atlanta, Georgia. It's an amazing school district that, like Portland Public Schools, runs a large number of dual language programs. And they have some really extraordinary district leadership there that's invested not just actual resources, but a lot of social and political capital in growing dual language there. So we were talking to a teacher candidate, a woman who was a graduate of the local school system of Gwinnett County and was now at one of the local universities getting ready to do her student teaching and getting ready to become, hopefully, a full-time Gwinnett County Public Schools teacher, a bilingual teacher. And she said, one of the things that really bugs me is that I spent my first year taking a bunch of remedial coursework. Not only that, I had to take a jogging class. She said, it was fine. I needed the exercise, but I had to pay for that. I had to take a jogging class to become a bilingual teacher. That wasn't necessary. I don't know why I was doing that. So if you're at an IHE, think about this. Is there anything in your teacher training core that just doesn't necessarily need to be there, especially for bilingual teacher training or for bilingual teacher candidates? And then finally, IHEs and CBOs can be looking for ways, exactly, I see in the chat, it was patently insane. It's the kind of thing that if I look back, maybe I need to follow up with that local university because it almost feels impossible for that to be true, right? This jogging class. But anyway, the last thing also is that you can be looking at doing these partnerships. And what I mean by that is I've presented this as traditional teacher training alternative models, right? Something that looks a lot like getting your degree and your teaching credential from Rhode Island University or doing Teach for America, but there's actually a lot of room in between those where traditional teacher training programs are working in ways that are providing, like in Portland State, right, are providing some of the coursework needed to take up alternatively trained teachers and bring them up to the level that they need to be successful in the classroom. Next.
That was
all right.
Okay.
So that's all for me. Thanks again for letting me be here. I'm really grateful. And like I said, please know that what I'm trying to show you is this is how to think about this as a policy matter. How do you reduce a lot of very complicated, organic, and valuable, meaningful relationship-based stuff into the big levers that somebody at the state can write a law, pull a lever, send some money, set some rules, and make a difference. I don't want this to be construed as oversimplifying. There's so much nuance that has to be built into these things. But at the end of the day, and I'm kind of haunted by this in the work that I've done, I've spent a lot of years in policy research where folks who sit in my seat do things like say, they recommend things like teachers in schools should engage families in linguistically competent and culturally relevant ways that are driven by data. And that's a good thing. That's something that should happen. It is also completely impossible for policy to touch. There is no way to mandate that happening because it's largely outside of measurement. It's the sort of thing that's difficult to fund and to put into a structure. And so when you're thinking at a policy level, how do you do this advocacy? It ends up oftentimes having to reduce to what can we measure? What can we fund? How can that structural change affect and impact existing other structures and labor markets for that matter? So on that, let me stop talking. I'm way, way more than I needed to. Thank you so much.
That's quite all right, Conor. I think we're all fascinated by what you and Michael and Laura and Rabia have been saying all morning long. But now is the time for asking questions of any of the presenters today. And I had asked Laura and Rabia and Denise to keep track of the questions in chat and see if they could maybe throw one out, or if you would like to use the icon for raising your hand, feel free to do that at this time. We have about 10 or 15 minutes where we can engage in questions and answers. So let me ask if Laura or Rabia have a question that they picked up from the chat that we can throw out to respond to at this moment.
It looks like we have a question in the chat that was just added, Phyllis.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Laura. Okay.
It's from Claudia Rinaldi. The question is, I worry about the need of bilingual teachers who also need how to support students in special education. So I suppose it's not quite a question, but more of a statement, but she read my mind and she asked a follow-up question. And she said, what can we do to expand preparation?
I guess I can go first, but only to mostly punt. I mean, I would tell you that the challenge of what I've heard these students often refer to as dual identified students, students who are identified as linguistically diverse and or English learners, but also who have IEPs. One is, as a researcher, we simply do not have good data on where these students are, whether they're being over-identified or under-identified. Most research suggests both, that students are being misidentified for IEPs and misidentified as English learners, depending on the intersection of those two different identifications. And furthermore, in part because we don't have the data, good data on where these students are and how many we have and how they're being served, it's very difficult historically for us to get very clear on exactly how to support these kids. This is one of those times in the research where the best I've heard is usually the anecdata. You hear from teachers where there are efforts that are relatively small, micro, local, even down to the school or classroom level of things that folks are trying. But yeah, I mean, just like sadly, I think we're a long way on that.
I see that Jill has her hand up. Jill, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, good morning. My question is for Conor. I was wondering if you knew of any existing research, or maybe this is something you've been thinking about or working on the discrepancy in requirements for teachers in bilingual settings and administrators in bilingual settings. In Massachusetts, there's no current requirement for leaders of dual language programs to hold the bilingual education endorsement, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have not done that research. Maybe appropriately, it's something we've recently pitched, actually. We were working to try to get a funder who'd be interested in doing a relatively structured scan of different teaching requirements for bilingual or dual language teachers around the country. I have seen some efforts to do that, but they usually don't break out. You'll see something like 36 states out of 50 require this part of bilingual teacher training or whatever, some version of that, but usually they don't publish some sort of a full table explaining exactly what's going on. So it is something we're hoping to do. And again, the goal would be to get that out and then to start doing some more targeted research on whether we can show in states where these credentials are required, is there any way to link that to teacher dynamics? Do we see more bilingual teachers depending on which credentials we require? Are they of higher quality? Can we get some metrics on that? But no, I'm not aware of anybody who's done that research in a really careful way yet, or certainly not recently.
Okay, thank you. I'm just thinking from the administrator side, if you're leading bilingual programs and you haven't had that competency background or experience, and then you're coaching teachers on the ground, what that looks like in impacting overall program development. Thank you for your answer.
Can I jump in? And I wanted to add something to that. So I think that's a really important question to be raising and an important thing for us to be considering. I don't know of research that's specifically looked at that, but one of my colleagues, Rabia and I have a colleague at URI, Dr. Amy Guerrero, who's been working really hard to build cohorts of leaders to get them ESOL certified, so to get them some experience and exposure to MLL education at the very least. So I think that's been an important first step. It isn't something that I think she's been researching, but it's something that she's been doing to support that need.
And collecting data, Laura.
Oh, and collecting data, great.
Yes,
so hopefully
yes.
that will come out soon.
And it's not a ESL certification, just to clarify, it's an endorsement it's a 2-course endorsement for leaders, school leaders, and they can use their funding resources and they can use that endorsement towards their PLUs that are required.
Right. Thank you for the clarification. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a step in the right direction. I certainly think for bilingual education, that would be an important step. And I know, to my knowledge, in Rhode Island, it's not required either. So I think that's an important thing for us to think about in terms of kind of what kind of cohort models could we maybe envision for bilingual administrators in bilingual settings as well.
Okay, thank you, Laura and Rabia. And I see Silvana has her hand up.
Thank you. So my question is for Dr. Williams. So I know that in 2023, you confirmed that since California adopted the seal of biliteracy, so most of the states adopted too. So my question is, how or what do you think about the seal of biliteracy really making impact or no at recruiting high school students into education major?
This is perfect because Jerry Chafee just put this in the chat as well, a version of this question. I have heard of that as an idea that people think is good, especially in California. I have heard less of that as an idea that is being implemented actively in many places. Everybody, I believe, I'm just going to trust, knows the seal of biliteracy, so I'm not going to go through that. But the short of it is, I've heard of places, right, of course, where you can get college credit based on having obtained the seal. I think it would be relatively straightforward, let's say hypothetically for some state, maybe in New England, call it Rhode Island, let's just get any state, or Massachusetts, or to say, okay, if you have our seal of biliteracy, not only will we give you college credit, but we will give you this specific college credit towards your degree in education. And it would be, I think, relatively straightforward to give some sort of bonus to encourage people to go that direction. There are some programs here and there, and they're usually, from what I've seen, they're relatively loose. I was just starting to type to Jerry when you asked this question. Gwinnett County, for instance, down in Atlanta, we outlined this in our report, has this career and technical education high school where they have an education track in it for high school students who want to explore teaching careers while they're still in high school. And then they have some local universities, Georgia Gwinnett College and Georgia State University, that do a lot of the teacher training for Gwinnett County Public Schools. So they've tried to build some links from that high school to these programs to then take those kids or the teacher candidates from those programs back into Gwinnett County Public Schools. But it's all pretty informal still. I don't think there's any sort of official memorandum of understanding where if you graduate with this seal of biliteracy and you finish from this education track that you get an accelerated rate through so that then we can hire you back quickly or with some sort of scholarship support like that. Like it's missing some of the resource pieces that would make it a true pathway, I think. I'm sure there must be someone out there who's doing it. I've heard rumors that this is happening in LA, but I've never actually encountered it.
Thank you.
Phyllis, I have two questions that are related that were also in the chat. And they are for Doctors Guerrero and LaChance, Joan. It's the first question says, is the National Dual Language Teacher Preparation standard something that has been approved nationally? And the second follow-up to that is, what were the areas that have emerged as needing to be included in the standards?
Joan,
Yeah.
go for it. I'll be
Okay.
happy to join in.
I love it. So thank you for the question. The answer to the first part is yes. The Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, CAPE, endorsed them in 2021. So I think it's important from the federal perspective right here to note that the Department of Education doesn't necessarily endorse anything, right, in regards to standards. They disseminate information, but it's up to individual states to then approve and align their departments of education with regard to standards that are approved in those particular states. So for example, Washington State has adopted the standards in their entirety. I think the only national umbrella that that is in existence has to do with accreditation. So to the second part, can you remind me of the second part about?
Sure. It says, what were the areas that have emerged as needing to be included in the standards?
Got it. So recent discussion has sort of brought us into understanding how collaboration and shared leadership gets woven in because of the layers and the multidimensional aspects of policy and how these things trickle down into the classroom. We need to look at how leadership and collaboration is enacted upon in the standards. I think the other piece is what Michael discussed in terms of branching out, not just for university level pre-service teachers, but also working with in-service teachers through the development of this national dual language certificate, so that in-service teachers can get access to advanced competencies in their field as well. Michael, what did I leave out?
No, I would just add that, yeah, I apologize if it didn't come across clearly enough, but yeah, the certificate idea is aimed at facilitators who will then go into their local school districts and work with the practicing dual language teachers. But Joan and I and David and our stakeholders, the other members of the consortium have thought about the notion of also creating a certificate around the standards aimed at school administrators. It might take on a different nature in terms of, you know, how long and what might be the central focus, but the idea would be that the foundation of that certificate would be anchored to the standards. And then we'd have to try and figure out how to best, right, make it accessible to school administrators. Would it be a 1 week, 2 week summer intensive institute, or what might it be? So and even in all of the conversation about pathways and policy struggles for certification and all these issues, what remains constant is the knowledge base. And so you know, within, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the standards should be able to, you know, if it's going to be a grow your own model, well, you can still use the standards. If you're going to be talking about pre-service ed programs, well, you can use the standards. If you're talking about professional learning, you can use these standards. Okay, that shouldn't vary. What will vary is, you know, how it's structured and how it's delivered and so on and so forth. And one other thing about, I thought you were asking too about what might be missing, and it came up earlier, and I tried to go back to our document. I remember Joan and I had a conversation with stakeholders in Minnesota a couple of years ago. They were looking at our standards, at these standards, and they brought up the issue of ASL. And Joan and I kind of looked at each other like, yeah, I mean, ASL is a language. Why isn't it included in the standards? And we made a little note of it. The other thing to keep in mind is that the standards we like to think of it as a living document. Under CAPE, you're limited by the number of standards you can include. I believe 7 is the maximum. Is that correct, Joan? So we have considered the idea of, I mean, maybe we need a 7th standard aimed at, special needs students. It could very well be. But that is, there's just so much work there's so much work to do and so little time. We've got some plans, we've got some timelines, and we're just trying to get these things done, and then we can take on, new challenges. But that's a great point.
Laura, I see that your hand is up. Go ahead. Feel free to ask a question.
Sure. I don't know who I should ask this question around. In the nation, is there any state or, organizations or higher ed that specifically address language-based how to teach reading, especially foundational literacy skills specific to the language that teachers are to teach? Because, our language teachers are to pass the licensure test that's designed for English reading, literacy skill development and so forth. And I really find the need of the awareness of language specific foundational literacy development and reading in general, reading instruction in general. I wonder if there is anything out there, or people are aware, or consideration or license requirement and so forth. So I just wanted to bring that up because that seems to be such a barrier in addition to just English-based licensure test.
This is strange. I'm a trained political scientist and I'm an amateur at best linguist. So mostly I've tried to stay out of the newest iteration of the literacy wars. What I would say is I don't think there has been a structured effort at the national level to engage the new round of science of reading, early literacy efforts, and translate that into a bilingual specific, dual language specific literacy training approach. What I'll say is, like, beyond that, I know it's extremely controversial, especially in California, around science of reading. I'm going to there was a joint statement that, okay, good. I see people nodding. There's a joint statement on the science of reading and English learners or emergent bilinguals that came out pretty recently. I've, again, tried to stay out of this because it's not my area of core expertise. I would just say this. My read of the research is that it basically is the case that the science of reading is still the right approach for English learners with some modest modifications, that there's still lots of value to explicit instruction around decoding and phonemic awareness. It will vary quite a bit depending on home language, and that's part of why I'm trying to speak in careful tones here. I mean, so for instance, character-based languages, phonemic awareness is largely a meaningless concept, whereas radical awareness is not. It's a very core concept. But if we're talking about languages that share large parts of an alphabet, well, decoding in Spanish and decoding in English are going to be different. They are going to have they're cousins. They have some common sound outs that can be valuable. Maybe I should leave it at that. I would just say that I have not yet seen strong counter research arguing that the science of reading is not the right approach in bilingual settings and dual language settings as well. I think that there's just some supplements that need to be added to it. So anyway, mostly I just defer to the joint statement there.
Okay. I don't know if Kathy Escamilla wants to say a few words because she is one of the authors of the joint statement and she is here with us today. Or should we table this particular question because it can lead us into another tunnel that we may not want to go into today? But I'll give that option to Kathy.
Right. So I don't want to say much because I think it might take us down a rabbit hole that you hadn't intended, and I don't want us to get off of the main agenda. My take on the joint statement, because I helped to write it, was that it was an acknowledgement that teaching children to be literate is way more than teaching them to decode and teaching them foundation skills in any language. And my fear is that as a nation, we were kind of stuck in this whole idea that it was all about foundational skills. And so the attempt was to add some substance, I think important substance to the idea of that teaching beginning readers needs to involve cultural awareness, needs to involve an honor to the internal structure of any language that you're teaching the foundational skills, and that it's way beyond foundational skills, that things like writing, oral language are also really, really important to learning to read. And so that's all I'm going to say. It was an attempt to expand a perception of what we need to do to help young kids learn to read and write.
Thank you, Kathy. All right, I think we have time for one last question to bring us back to the teacher piece. Mike Gary, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. My question was, I put it in the chat. What lever or levers do we need or can we use to break the monolingual focused assessment and accountability system that maintains dual language bilingual programs and hence the teacher preparation programs as nice to have rather than the game changer that it really is for our kids?
So this might get us into another rabbit hole as well. But what I'm reading from your question, Mike, is this idea that this assessment question is not necessarily addressed well in teacher preparation programs currently. And this is an area that you're wondering about as well. I don't know if Laura or Rabia want to respond to this because they are teacher prep actually all four of you are. Michael and Joan are also teacher preparation programs. So
yeah, I can jump in, but I mean, I think this is such a core question that relates to a lot of what we're talking about in terms of some of the barriers that are faced as well, even with teachers coming into bilingual programs. Yeah, I mean, I think this requires advocacy on all of the same spheres we were talking about, because one is moving away from this high stakes assessment accountability system, but another is, making sure that we are finding ways, we are going to be giving assessments, making sure that we are giving assessments in all of the languages that the students speak so that we can have a more holistic idea of what bilingual programs are capable of doing. I mean, I think we have so much data that shows that they're effective. And so I don't know if it's enough to speak their language in order to fight back against it. I think we need to have kind of a multi-pronged approach, which is pushing back against the monolingual focused system by making it not so monolingual, but also pushing back against that accountability system that I think is continuing to show what it's designed to show, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. I think we could have probably an entire session just thinking about what it would look like to start to break apart that system and how we might approach it from different avenues.
Okay. All right, so we'll bring us back. It's now time to go into breakout sessions. I want to say that I am so impressed that you have stayed with us the entire time. I am very honored by that. It is now time to join colleagues in a reflection of today's presentations, participate in small group discussions. We've organized the breakout sessions by role. So you will either be with leaders of higher ed or community organizations or state education departments, leaders or legislators or district and school leaders. A facilitator has been assigned in each breakout room and will share a note-taking document to guide your discussions. With colleagues in the room, we ask that you respond to the following questions. Which of the challenges identified today can your role directly impact? In light of everything that has been presented today, what possible solutions do you see for addressing these challenges? and what next steps need to be taken to turn these possible solutions into a reality. At the end of your discussions, we're hoping that you will be able to identify some possible next steps. We're going to reconvene as a large group to share some of the stories that you discuss in your large breakout rooms. We'll ask the facilitators to help us with that. And then we will shortly, after that, we'll be giving you a link to a Padlet so that you can let us know what actions you've identified for yourself. So Laura is going to be breaking us into different rooms, and we actually have a half an hour to chat with each other before we come back. Any questions that people may have before we go into breakout room? Okay, take it away, Laura.
There's one question from somebody who is wondering if it's possible to share the questions in the chat. The questions will also be in the document that your breakout room facilitators will share with everybody. But also paste them to the chat as well.
I'll paste them into the chat right now.
Okay, thank you, Phyllis. I'm going to open up the breakout rooms for 30 minutes now.
So lots of good ideas.
Yeah, all good ideas. Yeah. Patrick, I think you
Okay, sure. Thanks, everyone. We were a small group, which was nice. We are all from IHEs, so we're representing IHEs here and talking about we spend a lot of the time talking about challenges because there are a lot of challenges, but we also have some possible solutions and next steps. So the first thing that we identified were labels. So thinking about bilingual education as this umbrella category into which DL sort of gets tossed. That's not necessarily an appropriate description of the work that we're doing, right? We're trying to be very specific about the advocacy for dual language, DLBE programs, right? We don't necessarily want to just say, oh yeah, all bilingual teaching is fine, right? And so we are advocating for dual language. That is a specific brand of bilingual education. It is the most ethical and equitable brand of dual language education or of bilingual education, but it is not just bilingual education. So we need to be specific about what we're advocating for. Another big one is the chicken or the egg problem. So we need more DLBE programs to train teachers, but we need more teachers to justify the creation of additional programs. Finding these teachers has been an enormous challenge for schools, and it also has implications for IHEs, right? The other thing that we found, which is sort of it's not just an IHE issue, but it is an issue that involves certification. So we find that teachers, by the time they get through their coursework while they're working, in many cases, right? They get their certification, they pass their state licensure exams, they're exhausted, and then they get into the dual language classroom and they burn out and they don't stay in the field. Another one was the need for extensive collaboration for research to do more of the work, such as what URI is doing in terms of its white papers and looking into all of the different multifaceted questions that relate to licensure and teacher prep. And another thing we identified as necessary is integrating certification tests into the coursework, because what we find is that a lot of times teachers are able to do our coursework and then they aren't able to pass the state licensure exams, either due to language barriers or due to the specific structure of the exam, right? So possible solutions, looking more towards the NDLE TPS, right? Looking at having these teacher preparation standards be truly adopted on the national level, creating additional certification programs, and then also making the certification tests available in other languages so that we can break down what we consider to be linguistically unjust practices, particularly for teachers who are teaching 100% in Spanish, right? And then the actionable next step is continued collaboration, where we feel that there's this need for triangulation between school districts, institutions of higher education, and then regional and national dual language organizations, taking the MABE, UMass Bilingual Hub, and the school districts we work with as a perfect sort of triangle. That relationship has been a very healthy one where I can contribute the research, or higher educators can contribute the research. The organization can contribute the practice and the practical advice and the professional development, and the school districts benefit from both of those sources. And so thinking about partnerships as this sort of three-way process is very critical.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. Lots of great ideas. I'm watching the time, and I'm going to just make a comment before I get Mike Gary to talk, that Michael Guerrero put in, professors need to publish in non-English languages. And he's been telling me that for a long, long time. So I want to make sure that that shout out is out there. So Mike Gary, I'll let you be the last person to share, and then we'll close up get to the next series of slides that we're going to finish up with.
Right. Thank you, Phyllis. And just I want to do a shout out to Patrick and Maria Luisa and the Western Mass Bilingual Hub that has been essential to the growth of the dual language programs in Holyoke, where I work, and within our group of district and school leaders, we had representatives from Springfield and Amherst, and that partnership has been essential. So thinking about through the lens of school and district leaders, we identify that there are systemic pieces that need to change, and that feels really big, and that we can't necessarily move a mountain individually. That part of the challenge can be turnover in staff and feeling like you have to start from scratch often, from year to year, starting from scratch with administrators who don't have requirements to really understand bilingual programs. There's no policy requirement there, but you're coaching up and you're coaching sideways and you're coaching down, like you're coaching and you're advocating throughout all of your work, right? And leveraging your sphere of influence to build up individuals. So even if you think there's that risk that they might only be there for a year, you build them up, build them up, build them up. And, if they go off to another district, they've been built up, right? So we're doing our part to build the system. So I think the last piece that we kind of finished is that we need to continue to come together in groups like this, because in your own little sphere, you might get it can feel discouraging. So coming together in groups like this to calibrate, recharge, and plan your next steps is also that's a really important part of all of our next steps.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Actually, when you start to say I'm representing the LEAs, I realized I never asked for a response from this community-based organizations group or the State Department leader group. So why don't we take a moment? Maybe Joan can share. I think you were the facilitator of the state leaders. Joan, if you don't mind sharing, and then I'll ask Erin was the one who shared for the community-based.
Absolutely. So we talked a lot of, as you can imagine, about certification and policy. Some of the challenges that we recognize are out there are that while we all agree internally within our own departments, even at the SEA level, there's definitely a disconnect between that and then what has to happen on the legislative side to impact policy that aligns with what we believe to be right. We recognize that funding is a challenge with some possible solutions, especially in this geographical region, about getting states to understand capacity with possible pooling of funds and reciprocity for staffing and certification between states. And then lastly, because I know I'm being very cognizant of time, we need to understand that at the state and local education agency levels, we are maneuvering tensions, right, between maintaining these rigorous teacher prep standards and then avoiding unnecessary barriers. So what we don't want to create are certification parameters that then exclude the teachers that we already have. So how can we work to grandfather in, extend competencies for in-service teachers and things to that nature?
Okay.
So
thank you.
Excellent.
All right. It's okay to take the time to share our thoughts. We can make the other things much shorter.
Okay.
I think, Erin, I had asked you to share. I think you were the breakout facilitator for the community-based organizations.
Yes. And we were also a small group, and we talked a lot about a lot of the same challenges around licensure. And really the need to simplify and have a more reciprocal licensure across states, that having state level decisions causes a challenge. So if we could find a way nationally to kind of collaborate to have more reciprocity across states, that was one thing we discussed. We also talked a bit about ways to recognize the high school students who are coming out of these programs for their language skills, and like to have clearer pathways for them into dual language teacher preparation programs. So different ways to celebrate the language skill that they bring, whether through public presentations of their languages and identity, or through college credits in the language that help put them on a pathway to more easily or more efficiently access certification in bilingual dual language education and whatever other area they might want to pursue.
Okay, thank you.
Can I
Yes.
just piggyback really quickly on something that Erin said, because it
Sure.
came up in our conversation as well, to the national reciprocity piece, Erin. Having an organization present like NALPA, and they're here, you know, with us today as well, it's really critical because the certification parameters are governed at the state level. Having that collaboration in an organization like NALPA and Emma, that is how we get to that national understanding, rather than having one policy. That there's danger in that as well, right? Like each state needs to have its own contextual flexibility, but having them come together with common and shared agreements about certification through NALPA, through Emma, through MABE is really what we need to look at.
Thank you, Joan. I was actually thinking that exactly that as I was listening to both of you, that
Right.
there's work to do at the national level, and there are people here today who can come together and figure out how to do that action. So
yes, we're
which
really
leads me
lucky
right-
to have. We're really
ahead.
lucky to have Connecticut taking on the NALPA presidency role. So thank you.
Okay. So that leads us to the very last action that we're going to ask you to do today. We are putting in the chat a link to this Padlet, and based on your role, if you don't mind, please write an action that you think you can try and work towards changing the situation that we have with teacher shortages and bilingual teacher shortages in particular for bilingual and dual language programs. I'll share it this way. What I wanted to also say is that if you don't have a specific idea, but you like an idea that somebody else is posting, you can actually just heart it. You know, there's a way to just click on it and say, I like that idea too, and add some comments if you would like as well. I hope everybody has access to the Padlet and it's not a problem. Yep, they do, because I already see some responses going on, and you can take a look at them as well. We'll just take a few minutes to let people write a few ideas down. One thing that I can let you know is that we do pay attention to the ideas that are shared with us, and we do try to find innovative, creative, persistent ways of advocating and trying to engage to act on the actions that you come up with. The great part is that collectively we come up with so many different possibilities. I have this belief that when one door closes, we look for another door to open. And so you're helping us find all those different doors to open by sharing your ideas here today. Okay, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and close our event today. We have shared a lot of resources in the chat, and we have posted here other resources, some that we've used today, some that we are directly related to the topic that we talked about. We will be sharing these resources with you after the close of probably next week sometime. And I just want to thank, the last slide here is this thanking everybody, Rabia and Laura in particular. Joan, actually, even though she wasn't a speaker here, she actually was very integral to the white paper as well. Aradna, Denise, Lauda, for helping with Zoom, all the facilitators in the breakout room sessions. I just said to them, I know you'll accept my invitation to be a breakout facilitator, and they did. And so thank you very much for doing that. We will share our resources from today, our actionable steps that we learned about today, and the recording from today as well with all of you as sometime next week or so. So thank you for joining us today.